Hello everybody, Professor Barth here, Associate Professor of History at Arizona State University. Welcome to part 3 of our section on John Locke, itself part of a larger series on the foundations of Western political thought. If you have not yet watched part 1, the introduction, you're going to want to do so. Click on the link above. Also, last week I posted a video, part 2, on the historical context. What was England like at the time of John Locke? We do a brief survey from the restoration of the crown in 1660 all the way up through that glorious day, November 5th, 1688, the revolution of 1688. Today, we're going to take a look at Locke's theory on the state of nature and then the transition to civil government. And we're going to utilize his second treatise of government, which was written sometime in the early 1680s. It wasn't published until 1689 on the heels of the Glorious Revolution. Now, what do we mean by the state of nature? It's come up before in this series. Hobbes talked about the state of nature. Locke speaks at length about the state of nature. The state of nature is a hypothetical scenario, a hypothetical world or situation, state, that exists pre-government or prior to government, even prior to civilization itself. And most Enlightenment thinkers, including Locke, believed that this hypothetical of the state of nature was a useful tool from which to come up with theories on civil government itself. How did government come about? And so, for our purposes, John Locke begins quite early on in this second treatise of government, looking at the state of nature. He says, in fact, if we wish to understand political power aright, we must consider what state all men are naturally in. So this is not even optional for Locke. Taking a look at this hypothetical scenario, what state are all men naturally in, is necessary if you want to understand political power correctly. And what is that state? What is that natural state of man? Well, he said, it is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. So this is the state of nature. All individuals, all men. And of course, when we say all men, we understand that to mean human beings have in the state of nature this perfect freedom to act in any way they wish without asking leave of any other man. But there is this boundary within the bounds of the law of nature. What is that law of nature? Well, he says the law of nature is discoverable. You can know and understand the law of nature. It may be discovered, he says, by reason. And this law of nature is universal. It obliges everyone. No man is exempt from the law of nature. This law of nature, discoverable by reason. In Christian theology, it is taught that, and Paul teaches this in Romans, that God revealed his law in nature through reason, through our natural capacities outside of any other special revelation or written word like the Bible. So this law of nature, it's universal, it's discoverable. And what is it? This law of nature, according to Locke, instructs, teaches, demands that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So That's the boundary on your action in a state of nature. This applies everywhere. This is a universal. It's not specific to to European culture or Western culture. No, it's applicable to all human beings. And it's grounded in the fact that human beings are, quote, all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, all the servants of one sovereign master, sent into the world by his order and about his business. They are his property, whose workmanship they are, made to last during his, not one another's pleasure. This is a statement from Locke that natural law and, by extension, natural rights come from our Creator, from God himself, from this omnipotent and infinitely wise maker. All human beings, regardless of race, color, ethnicity, age, social station, social class, all human beings are the workmanship of that omnipotent and infinitely wise maker. We are also all servants of that same sovereign master. Who is the sovereign master? The Lord above. And so it is God's prerogative to create this natural law, and this is the law that God has established. And it is, again, discoverable in nature through the power of reason. We see here some obvious similarities with a statement that Jefferson writes in his Declaration of Independence. And in fact, as we proceed through this section on John Locke, we're going to find so many parallels between Locke and Jefferson. And of course, Locke preceded Jefferson by nearly a century. That famous line in the Declaration of Independence: we hold these truths to be self-evident. Don't overlook the power of just this opening clause. These truths are self-evident. They're discoverable through reason. What are those truths? This is not subjective. This is a universal truth. What is that truth? That all men are created equal. Does this mean that they all have the same capacity, physical, even mental capacity? No, it doesn't necessarily mean that at all. What it means is that we are all the product of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker. We are all created in that image, the workmanship. And so we are all entitled equally, to the same natural rights, and we are also all equally obliged to follow natural law, God's law. No matter who you are obligated to follow that law. That's what Jefferson and Locke mean by equality in this sense. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, meaning rights that can't be taken away from them. They possess these rights. Why? It was given to them by their Creator. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So those are our natural rights, as Jefferson puts it in the Declaration of Independence. Locke said life, liberty, and property, or possessions. Sometimes he says life, liberty, possessions. Sometimes he says life, liberty, and estates. life, liberty, and property. Here, Jefferson, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So you see there the overlap, of course, between Locke and Jefferson on natural rights, on natural law, and where that comes from. Now, just by way of clarification, Locke is very careful to differentiate between a state of liberty and a state of license. There's a difference between liberty and license, between freedom and licentiousness. In a state of true liberty, you do not have license to destroy others. In fact, Locke even argues you don't even have license to destroy yourself. Locke, for example, at some length, labors to prove that an individual in a state of nature would not have the liberty to sell himself into slavery. That actually that would violate this law of nature, and so you could not decide for whatever reason to sell yourself into slavery, because it would destroy yourself. It would violate those liberties that are natural to you. And so there are bounds on what you can do in a true state of nature and a state of liberty or freedom. Now, on this question of natural right and natural law, there are key differences between Locke and Thomas Hobbes. Of course, we took a close look at Thomas Hobbes last year. As a reminder, Hobbes says that that natural right, he defines natural right, or the right of nature, as the liberty that every individual has to preserve his own life, and the liberty to do anything within your own judgment and reason that you believe is most effective at preserving your own life. So, according to Locke, in a state of nature, you have a right. If you believe that to preserve your life, you need to take out this, you need to kill this individual, or you need to seize his property, seize his farm, or whatever, or his livestock, in order to preserve your life, you have a right to do that in a state of nature. Locke would say, no, you don't have license to do that. That would violate natural law. Or Hobbes, in the state of nature, liberty is basically, it is what Locke would define as licentiousness, or a state of license. He says liberty is properly understood is the absence of external impediments. So a free man, according to Locke, in a state of nature, can do whatever he wants to do. Okay, there's no bounds to what a free man in a state of nature can do. He has that right in a state of nature to do whatever he wishes. In the state of nature, Locke says, every man has a right to everything. And so because of that, there can be no security to any man in a state of nature. The law of nature, according to Hobbes, simply forbids a man to do anything that would be destructive of his own life. And then Hobbes concludes, or derives from this law of nature, this requirement that men eventually contract to or covenant one with another to create government, because government is the most effective guarantor of each man's life. But you see there, very different view of natural right and natural law. From Locke's perspective, natural law, you can't do anything that harms another person in their life, health, liberty, or possessions. And then natural right operates within those bounds of the law of nature. Quite different from Hobbes. I think this is one reason, or this is probably the main reason why, when you read Hobbes, the Hobbesian state of nature is a dog-eat-dog world. It is You could even say a Mad Max scenario where everyone has a right to everything and every man pursues it. Okay, so that men are just desperate to have civil government. Locke agrees that in a state of nature there is great insecurity, which leads men to form a social contract to create government. However, there does seem to be a bit more faith in human nature in Locke than anything you'll find in Hobbes. Hobbes definitely seems to be more pessimistic and more cynical about human nature. Not that Locke is this, Rousseauian optimist who believes that human beings can be perfected, and no, Locke, he's a believer in original sin, but he still believes that in a state of nature you have this natural law that puts boundaries on human action. The problem, in a state of nature, how do you enforce natural law? Well, in a state of nature, the enforcement of natural law is, quote, put into every man's hands, whereby everyone has a right to punish the transgressors of that law to such a degree as may hinder its violation. That's obvious. If you're living in some situation where there's no government and somebody, murders your friend or family member or does commit some awful crime that violates the basic law of nature, it is now your right to punish that transgressor. You are the enforcement arm of the law of nature because there is no government. At that point, you have a state of war. Those who break the law of nature, and then those whose rights have been violated, now have, according to Locke, entered into a state of war. And now you have force, violence, need for self-defense. To avoid this state of war is one great reason, Locke says, of men's putting themselves into society and quitting the state of nature. So now we begin to transition over to civil government. Locke says, if man in a state of nature be so free as has been said, if he be absolute lord of his own person and possessions equal to the greatest and subject to nobody, why will he part with his freedom? Why would he? You're living in this state of perfect freedom. Yes, you have to live within the bounds of the law of nature that says you can't destroy others or violate their natural rights. However, that seems to be the state of freedom. Why would you give it up? Why will he give up this empire and subject himself to the dominion and control of any other power? To which it is obvious to answer, Locke continues, that though in the state of nature he hath such a right, yet the enjoyment of it is very uncertain and constantly exposed to the invasion of others. For all being kings as much as he, every man his equal, and the greater part no strict observers of equity and justice. So you see here his affirmation of this depraved aspect of human nature. The greater part, most people are not going to be strict observers of equity and justice in a state of nature. Therefore, the enjoyment of the property he has in a state is very unsafe, very insecure. This makes him willing to quit a condition which, however free, is full of fears and continual dangers. And it is not without reason that he seeks out and is willing to join in society with others who are already united or have a mind to unite for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and estates, which I call by the general name property. So there's your natural rights, life, liberty, and property. And why do people join in society with others? Well, for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and properties in the face of these fears and continual dangers. The great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. I'm going to do a whole, probably the final video in this section on Locke. We'll look at the Lockean notion of property, and we'll flesh that out because Locke has a lot to say about property. It's very fascinating. I think it merits an entirely separate video. We'll take a look at property under Locke. But, Locke continues, though men, when they enter into society, give up the equality, liberty, and executive power they had in a state of nature. Okay, state of nature, you have the executive power to enforce natural law. You're now giving that up. Nevertheless, though you are giving up that executive power, yet it being only with an intention in everyone, the better, to preserve himself, his liberty, and property. It's done only with this intention. The power of the society, or legislative constituted by them, therefore, can never be supposed to extend farther than the common good. What's he saying here? He said government, the purpose of government is for the common good, obviously. Therefore, the powers of government can never, or the actions of government can never exceed that. It can never transgress the common good, because obviously that violates the entire purpose for creating civil society. Moreover, besides the requirement that the governing authorities govern according to the common good, they must enact laws that are settled, standing rules, indifferent and the same to all parties. Settled, standing rules. What does that mean? It means written down, firmly in place, not obscured, not hidden away somewhere. Not the arbitrary whims of some despot, some decree all of a sudden put out there. No, these are settled standing rules, and they apply to everybody. They apply to everybody. Why is this a requirement according to Locke? Well, in the same way, why would individuals form a political society and community and then say, and you can govern for purposes other than the common good? They would never do that. In the same way, individuals would never form a political society and then say, well, and then you can establish laws that are, not applicable to everybody. And, and by the way, the laws don't need to be written down. They can be sort of made up as we go along. They would never do that. In the origins of government. Now, governments oftentimes will evolve into a system like that, in which case it becomes a tyranny. We'll discuss that for part 4. But in the origins of civil society, of civil government, as we transition from a state of nature, that's not how it operates. Political society, according to Locke, begins as individuals form a community, this community acting as a legislature of sorts, establish laws, establish these standing rules, and then delegate executive authority to particular men in order to enforce those rules and to punish offenders. Remember, this executive authority in the state of nature belonged to the individual, but now in civil society, that executive authority is delegated by the people to the governing authorities. What we have here is the Lockean social contract, where the people agree to submit to abide by known laws, standing rules, so long as those rules are respectful of natural law and their basic rights as citizens. And in exchange for that, the people, again, submit to that authority. The governing authorities, for their part, agree only to act for the common good, for the public good, agree to, refrain from arbitrary power, and vow to govern with respect to natural law. This contract can be broken. Well, who decides if it's broken? The people. We'll do a video, I think it'll be part 5, on resistance and revolution, and the second treatise in Locke's second treatise of government. The people in this arrangement always retain supreme power. They created it. They retain supreme power. The governing authorities act as a fiduciary power. They are entrusted by the people to carry out their end of the bargain, but if it's broken, it's broken. Okay? Note that in Locke's social contract, natural law still exists. The law of nature does not vanish. Unalienable rights. Locke says the obligations of the law of nature cease not in society. The law of nature stands as an eternal rule to all men, legislators, as well as others. This is very, very different from the Hobbesian social contract, where the people covenant every one with another and then renounce. That's actually a straight from Hobbes's book, a quote. Renounce their natural right. They renounce and transfer natural right to whom? Well, to the sovereign. That has the product of this covenant. And, of course, the covenant cannot be broken because every person in that society, in effect, is author of everything that the sovereign does. And so the sovereign, the man or the assembly, can do whatever they think is fit. But look at that difference. In Locke's system, the law of nature stands as an eternal rule. Locke also is clear to point out that political power must operate with the consent of the governed. He says this: men, being by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can be subjected to the political power of another without his consent. Consent is required because in the state of nature, you have these natural rights. No one can force you to be subjected to the political power of another without your own consent. And here we see, again, we return to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So there you have the purpose of government, to secure these rights. That's what Locke just said. Deriving their just powers from what? From the consent of the governed. Now, part of the deal in consenting to that government is that you must thereafter submit to the authority of that government. Locke says, quote, when any number of men have so consented to make one community or government, they are thereby presently incorporated and make one body politique. One body with the power to act as one body, which is only by the will and determination of the majority. Now, we'll see in part 4, Locke will talk about majoritarian rule and democracy and some of the problems affiliated with that. So we'll save that for part 4. But here, the majority is useful in helping to communicate the will and determination of the body in general. And the legislative power in particular operates by the will and determination of the majority. And thus, Locke continues, every man, by consenting with others to make one body politique under one government, puts himself under an obligation to everyone of that society to submit to the determination of the majority. Once you have consented to this government, you are now under the obligation to everyone else in that society to submit to the determination of the majority of that body politique. Now, what do we mean here by consent? You could say, I didn't consent to this. What does Locke mean? Well, Locke differentiates between express consent and tacit consent. The latter is far more common. Express consent would be, literally, signing your name and saying, I agree. and actually, we do see this in history. Think of the Mayflower Compact, or there are other instances in history where you actually do have an express consent of an individual to abide by the rules of this government. Or you could say someone who immigrates to this country and goes through the proper process of naturalization, and they become naturalized citizens, they expressly consent to this government. But what about those who are simply, born in said country, and do they consent to it? Well, Locke says, yes, actually, there's what he calls tacit consent. And what is tacit consent? Well, Locke says, for every man that has possessions or enjoyment in any part of the dominions of any government, the fact that they have possessions in that government doth thereby give his tacit consent, and is as far forth obliged to obedience to the laws of that government. Do you live in this country? Well, then you have tacitly consented to be governed by these authorities. Otherwise, why are you living here? Why do you have possessions here if you did not consent tacitly to this government? Now, for that to work, Locke acknowledges, men must always have the liberty to, quote, quit the said possession, and to go and incorporate himself into any other commonwealth, or to agree with others to begin a new commonwealth in any part of the world they can find free and unpossessed. So long as you have the liberty to leave, to get out of Dodge, and you choose not to, you choose to stay, then you have tacitly consented. I'm thinking back to the Cold War, behind the Iron Curtain. People in many parts of Eastern Europe under Soviet oppression were not allowed to leave. What, in East Berlin? I mean, they had to put up a wall. People were not allowed to leave. So that is not consent. This is not tacit consent. So that was an illegitimate power. The people had not consented to that rule. But so long as you have that liberty, you have tacitly consented to that government. So that concludes part 3. Part 4, we're going to take a look at the forms of civil government. And then part 5, we'll take a look at the Lockean theory of resistance and revolution, very relevant to our own country and very influential on the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Until then, see ya.